Thank you, Ben. Our concluding presentation is going to be given by Mr. Wade Goria, who's an historian, and he's the principal lecturer at the National Lighthouse Museum, which is right here in New York. And I've taken the liberty of giving the title of his presentation of Bringing the Stars to Earth, How Alexander Hamilton's Lighthouse Commission Launched a Technological Revolution in American Navigation.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here, and there's so much intellectual energy here, and down in Washington, and in our great country, and around the world. And it's the job of good government, of extraordinary people, to harness the energies, the entrepreneurship, the talents, the intellect of people in order to achieve great things. Your first thought might be lighthouses. We have a presentation here on going to the moon and going to Mars, and what does this have to do with lighthouses? So I want to clarify this for you at the outset. It's not because they look like rockets. We can eliminate that one. It's because lighthouses light the way to the sea, and the sea provides commerce and trade generates the money that's needed to do all these great things that we're talking about today. Without it, it doesn't happen. And I think we need to understand that right now. So I have a very little bit of time to talk about a great lot of things. But I'd like to introduce to you the idea of Alexander Hamilton as a guiding light of American commerce. Alexander Hamilton is one of those great people who existed in a moment of time, who was able to fashion one of the greatest countries on the history of the planet. Since we have other people from different countries here, I don't want to say the greatest country that ever existed, but one could make an argument for that. Let's just say this. And we have a presentation here now. Let me just. All right, we're gonna start off with a earliest known picture of Alexander Hamilton as a young boy growing up in the island of Nevis. He later would live in St. Croix. I'll just say this about Alexander Hamilton: he was a very sensitive, very engaging child. Most people who knew him as a young boy said he was a very kind and extraordinary young man. And I'll move on from that. This is the island of Nevis in the Caribbean. It's a very beautiful island. You know, the show Hamilton that has received so much attention, Lin-Manuel Miranda's musical that was based on Ron Chernow's book on Alexander Hamilton, gives you the idea that Hamilton is very different. He's sort of from a diverse background. He's Caribbean. And there's a little bit of a, I think, misconception here. The island of Nevis and St. Croix, where he later lived, gave him an extraordinarily unique background. But I'd like you to understand that the Caribbean islands, and certainly the sugar plantations of places like Nevis, were in many ways an extension of the 13 colonies. So that the next person that we see here, Nicholas Cruger, of Beekman and Cruger, this is one of the most important, arguably the most important experience of Alexander Hamilton's life. Hamilton did not come from the poor, struggling background that a lot of people would like maybe to fashion that he did. He had difficulties, and we won't go into all the family stuff. That's for another time. But he did have an extraordinarily gifted mother who came from a French Huguenot background, taught him fluent French, and the Marquis de Lafayette was very complimentary about Hamilton's French. In fact, Jefferson and Franklin were struggling like crazy with their French, and Hamilton spoke beautifully. So he learned about French culture, French economy, and he learned all about the business of Beekman and Cruger. Now, this was a mercantile house, and it's a good idea right here, just to give you a bit of detail that I think would help you understand just how important this background was for Hamilton, very practical. At the age of 14, he was literally running a counting house that was involved in every imaginable activity. There is no founding father that had this kind of background. He had intimate knowledge of the business of iron, lime, rope, mules, cattle, timber, bread, flour, rice, lard, pork, beef, fish, black-eyed peas, corn, porter, cider, pine, oak, hops, shingles, and lampblack, which is a resin that was used in sometimes in ink. He knew all about these products, where they came from, what they did in the economy. He had to compute currencies, Dutch stivers, Portuguese coins, Spanish pieces of 8, British pounds, Danish ducats. He knew everything about everything in terms of international commerce. And when he came to the United States at age 17, it's an extraordinary story. He went on a ship called the Thunderbolt, which first went to Boston. And the Thunderbolt was going past Cape Hatteras, which is one of the most dangerous waters in the world, known as the graveyard of the sea, graveyard of the Atlantic. And while he was passing Cape Hatteras, they hit rocks, they hit a shoal. And the ship almost burned down. One of the most common things that happens to a ship when it hits rocks is not only does it split and sink, but very often it knocks over lanterns and the ship burns up. So he had a very close call with death. But they survived. They put out the fire. The ship went on to Boston, and his career continued. Very interested in what was going on during the Revolution, because Nicholas Cruger, his uncle had been a longtime mayor of New York City. He was very interested in opposing the stamp tax. Hamilton knew what was going on in New York City. He didn't come in as some stranger and say, oh, this is an interesting place. I think I'm going to learn about the culture and become Secretary of the Treasury. He knew what was going on, and he had contacts. Nicholas Cruger opened a lot of doors, opened doors to people like John Jay and to Alexander McDougall, who became a very important military figure. And it was Alexander McDougall that got him a position as the captain of an artillery provincial company, which established his military reputation at the outset. By the way, one of the things that I think distinguishes him from the point of view of lighthouses right away, he led an expedition to try to take over Sandy Hook Lighthouse, which is located at the entrance of New York Harbor, because he knew how important it was as a guide for ships. That little expedition failed, but it nevertheless distinguished him as somebody who was very brave, bold, and smart about what was needed to be done. Now we have famous statue of Alexander Hamilton, George Washington, and the Marquis de Lafayette in Morristown Green. And again, you see three very, very important figures of the Revolution. There's so much to talk about. There's so little time. When Alexander Hamilton caught the attention of Washington, he was introduced by General Nathanael Greene. He had been so amazing by the accounts of so many people. And up in White Plains, Nathanael Greene had a chance to get to know Washington, eventually introduced him to Washington. And Washington, this is one of the great things about the United States and George Washington. This was a man who understood that a brilliant person need not be a threat to you. A brilliant person can be utilized in the interest, the greater interest of the United States. So George Washington is full of admiration for all the talent and skill that Hamilton has about everything. This is when he became Secretary of the Treasury, he did a great many things. He established, he had a series of reports that I'll just briefly summarize here. One was his report on credit. The other was on banking, and the other was on manufacturing. There's others, but we don't have time to talk about that. One of the things that he understood is that credit is one of the most important things, not only for a person, but for a nation. And unless we had good credit, we would not be able to borrow money at low prices. There would not be trust. There would not be the kinds of conditions that create entrepreneurship, that create trade and commerce. So he wanted to make sure he restored our credit. He wanted to give the country a solid banking foundation. He created a mint so that we could have a unified currency. And his manufacturers, it's really a very important thing. He has this idea that tariffs need to be levied, but not tariffs that are protective and restrictive and that are going to impede trade. Tariffs that are going to help the country establish a treasury. I want you to understand that Hamilton becomes the superintendent of the U.S. Lighthouse establishment as it was created on August the 7th, 1789, a full month and a half before he became Secretary of the Treasury. What comes first, the chicken or the egg? In this case, what comes first is the lighthouse establishment. Then you have a treasury. Because unless these ships are going to enter the harbor safely, not crash, you're not going to collect customs duties. And you're not going to be able to collect taxes from the people because we fought a 7-year revolution against taxes. So the American people are going to be asked, oh, we have another tea tax, but this time it's a U.S. tea tax. This time it's a U.S. stamp tax. It's not going to work. The only way you're going to be able to get money from the Americans is customs duties levied on ships that are going to be entering the harbors, and that will provide the basis for the revenue of the United States. So you see how important these lighthouses become. This is a famous portrait of Hamilton, which I just had to include because it's done by John Trumbull. And if you want to see it, it's at Sailor Snug Harbor. And Sailor Snug Harbor actually was made possible through the free legal services of Alexander Hamilton. Robert Richard Randall donated this Sailor Snug Harbor, which is located in Staten Island, so that sailors who were very often alone and without company would have a place to live in the most dignified circumstances. Sandy Hook Lighthouse, the oldest continuously used lighthouse in the United States. This is located Sandy Hook, New Jersey, present-day Fort Hancock, which is no longer operational. and I just thought you'd like to see it. It's a beautiful lighthouse, and if you've never visited it, you should go. This is my favorite lighthouse in America. This is the Twin Lights of Navesink. Just tell you a few things about this. It was imagined by Washington and Hamilton, but it was never built during their lifetime. This is located on the highest point on the Atlantic seacoast from Nova Scotia down to the Yucatan. It's a breathtaking place. It provides a breathtaking view. And if you've never been there, please go. This is the first place where the Pledge of Allegiance was recited in 1889. It's where Marconi discovered wireless. It's where radar was discovered. And it's actually the first building that you will see when coming to America. There used to be a 135-foot high flagpole with the biggest flag in America that would welcome people. And I'd just like to say, too, that the Lighthouse Board was highly professionalized in 1852 by a man named Joseph Henry, who decided to have operations for light experiments in the Smithsonian. And that's precisely why he wanted this building to look like the Smithsonian's Castle building. This is Cape Hatteras. This is known as Mr. Hamilton's Light. This is the lighthouse that should have been there when he was traveling on the Thunderbolt from the island of Nevis. And had there been a lighthouse, he wouldn't have had this horrible experience that ended up being the basis for the lighthouse establishment that we know today. This is the first lighthouse constructed by the new federal government. Keep in mind, this lighthouse bill is going to create the first infrastructure in America that is going to provide the basis for commerce that will provide the money for the U.S. Treasury. Cape Henry is located roughly where the Jamestown settlement was established, in the Chesapeake Bay in Virginia. And it was built by an architect that was very close to Hamilton's heart, John Macomb Jr., who also built his Grange in New York City and the City Hall. The revenue cutter ship. Now, a lot of people don't associate Alexander Hamilton with the Coast Guard, but he's really the father of the American Coast Guard, because the Coast Guard starts off as the revenue cutter service. Hamilton is going to establish 10 ships that will serve Portsmouth, New Hampshire, Boston, Long Island Sound, New York City, Philadelphia, 2 in the Chesapeake Bay, and 1 down in Savannah. These ships have the job of making sure that the goods that are entering are properly taxed, that there's no smuggling. Keep in mind that Beekman and Cruger had to deal with all kinds of smuggling activities. And at a very young age, he learned all about that. He knew all the sort of dastardly techniques that were used by smugglers. And he sent out circulars constantly to the masters of the ships to make sure that you treated the people in a decent way, but in an effective and firm way. We don't want people hating the American government the way they ended up hating the British government. Now, that Society for the Establishment of Useful Manufacturers was part and parcel with the establishment of Paterson, New Jersey. If you've never been to Paterson, New Jersey, you should go. It's a great place. I remember my father was in real estate, and I have a half Lebanese background, which is why I wrote a book on Lebanon. And he used to sell houses to Lebanese silk merchants who had operations in Paterson. And it was, Paterson became, in many ways, the embodiment of the ideas of manufacturing and industry that Hamilton brought forward to the United States. Now we have, I think this is just a great photo, and it's from the National Lighthouse Museum, showing a type of lens. Now this was sort of an improvement on the Fresnel lens. The Fresnel lens, as it developed, would allow lights to be projected as much as 75 miles. Members of the Navy and what was then the Coast Guard were constantly complaining in the early part of the century, we can't see those lights. They're invisible. What are you going to do about it? Well, the French had someone by the name of Augustin Fresnel, who himself was very much an embodiment of the Renaissance. And he was a man of genius. And he probably wouldn't have been brought forward had it not been for the fact that Napoleon took power. And he had the professional training that the Napoleonic France could provide. And Fresnel recognized that improvements could be made. I'm not a scientist, but I can just tell you briefly that Sir Isaac Newton had very much relied on a particle theory of light. And it was Augustin Fresnel's idea of the wave theory of light that is going to revolutionize light. So that the lighthouse in Navesink is going to receive this, and it'll be the equivalent of 900,000 candles seen 75 miles away. The glow could be seen 75 miles away. It is going to make entry into New York City safe and very operational for the people who are going to enter the city. And what's going to happen with the Fresnel light is it will open up new sea lanes never before used. The entire world will become globalized. The concomitant development of steam technology is going to allow this to happen as well. The screw propeller of John Erickson, who saved the Union during the American Civil War with his USS Monitor. These developments are going to create a global system of tremendous wealth and power. And it is that wealth and power that eventually would allow a man to land on the moon 50 years ago, which is why we're here today. So I think we all owe a very great debt of gratitude to Alexander Hamilton, to Augustin Fresnel, because these were the true geniuses that made this all happen. I'm going to end with a short quote here. And this was an editorial in 1862 in the Illustrated London Times that proudly proclaimed that Britain had now conquered an industry. The French had really led the way here, but the British were catching up. The Chance brothers were now making great lights. Had conquered an industry that had previously existed only in France. It extolled the lens's familiar intertwining of humanitarian and utilitarian impulses. Quote, "A manufacture from which emanate the useful and beautiful as kindred and inseparable spirits, where the highest faculties of the mind and the deepest sympathies of the heart have equal place, and where genius of humanity inspires and blesses the genius of science." Thank you very much.
What we're going to do now is the following, because of both time and also I understand that Helga's still with us, which I applaud.